Welcome to another in the series of Idea Collider on the subject of innovation with some of people I regard as innovation leaders. I'm delighted to be joined by Nooman Haque, Managing Director, Silicon Valley Bank here in London. So, Nooman, first of all, do you want to tell us something about who you are and what you do here?
Sure. So I am responsible for our life science business across EMEA. I've been here about 6 years or so. And life science for us it's a pretty broad church. It's really high-tech healthcare. So think biopharma, diagnostics, medical devices, and digital health, of course, a growing area as well. So we look after all those verticals. Our clients range from spin-outs from universities and incubators all the way up to established and public companies as well. Okay. So we describe ourselves as a bank that's an inch wide but a mile deep in terms of our focus. Okay. My own background, I started actually in consulting to the industry many years ago, but also looked at other sectors as well. Mm-hmm. So I spent a few years consulting to financial services and so on, but increasingly focused on pharma throughout my career. Yeah. And it was about 10 years ago made the switch from the advisory side to actually allocating capital into the sector.
Okay. And in terms of your role as a bank in the ecosystem, what's the kind of natural sort of fit between what you do and what they're doing to generate product and generate innovation?
Yeah, so I think our role, I guess it's twofold really. There's our role formally as a bank, right? We have lending capability to many institutions, and uniquely perhaps. So we're talking about innovation. We found a way many years ago to find a way to lend to companies that don't even have products, let alone revenues, let alone profits. Yeah. And that's an innovation, of sorts, financial innovation as well. Yeah. So that's a large part of what we do, but obviously we finance up to established companies as well. But I think the other part is we recognize our role in a wider, ecosystem, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, but if you think about the way that innovation happens, there's a sort of an archetype which is wrong of the lone inventor or the two inventors, the myths about the people in the garage working on their own or in a lab or whatever it is. But in reality, there's a social fabric underneath all that as well. There's connections to be made. There's capital to be raised. For example, and we play a role in fostering. Some of that. We've been here now in EMEA in London for 14 years. We know the investment community. We know the entrepreneurial community. So there's a lot more besides just deploying our balance sheet that we do. Yeah. And we've done this very successfully, obviously, in the Valley where we hail from and across the US. And we've been rolling it out, across the world, established in China, in Israel, office in Germany last year as well. So it's really, trying to foster that ecosystem.
That's cool. So if we look back to that thought about innovation not being about the inventor, but being about the organization, and I've been interested in you drawing parallels from non-pharma, non-healthcare environment as well. That's something I passionately believe is that innovation happens in an organization. It's not about the invention, it's about adding value to that invention. Is that what you see?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we can start, I think, even at a level higher, higher than that potentially. If you ask, kind of what innovation is, what are the ingredients to make it happen? You think of innovation as a change and improvement, the deployment of, a product or a process into a market, via a market or via, some other means for the betterment of people and, society. So when you look at it that way, innovation for me, there's, Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, used to put it this way. There's three things, right? There's invention, raw knowledge. There's the innovation itself, and then there's the diffusion of that innovation. So when it scales up, into a market as well. And that mechanism has actually been understood, at a theoretical level for 300 years, dawn of the Enlightenment, I suppose. So you do need those three ingredients. You need the generation of ideas, ideas in the public realm that people are free to use, en masse. Those ideas also need to be diffused so as many people can use them to then create ideas. The last part is actually what we commonly think of as innovation in the business sense, which is the creation of companies and bringing companies together with capital to deploy those into the marketplace, for example. But actually, the whole process starts, way before that. And naturally, in my world, working with companies, we tend to focus on the point at which a company is formed and it raises capital, and that's the part of the innovation ecosystem we mostly focus on, but not exclusively. But I think it's important to recognize that whether it's government departments, whether it's defense, whether it's universities, they are all part of this wider ecosystem. And there's no good, for example, in a funding perspective, having a lot of money directed towards, a lot of companies here, perhaps of the same type, when actually the ideas aren't coming through, at a base level. You need to think about the entire funnel, soup to nuts, I think.
Yeah, okay. And looping all the way back into, your thoughts about other industries and lessons learned there. How do you see pharma and healthcare in general, existing at that level? Because we don't bring that many products to market especially in the pharmaceutical sector. How do would you compare us well, or contrast us against what happens elsewhere?
So let's talk about big pharma, I think, as opposed to big biotech and early stage biotech. I think my take is that we set up a system of incentives and rules and property rights to encourage investment into drugs development, which is obviously very high risk. And roll on a century and a half, we have these enormous companies, these big pharma companies. They've evolved slowly. We all know they don't do as much in-house R&D as they used to. Argue that therefore they're not as innovative as they used to. They're largely sales organizations. They're slow to respond. They're looking for blockbusters always. They can't respond to personalized medicine. Their business models don't stack up. So I think superficially, I think there's a fair accusation to say that they are not as innovative. They're not keeping up. The companies behind them, the smaller biotechs, are coming up with highly targeted drug therapies, for example. They're the ones that are coming up with innovative pricing models, potentially, and it's the larger companies that are slow to respond. And I think that is fair, actually. And it's endemic, I think, of any industry that finds itself at a state of satisfaction. And we describe a large pharma company as being pretty satisfied. The investors are satisfied. They get whatever Novartis or Roche are churning out to their investors. The incentives for them to do different just aren't there anymore. Yes, they would argue that they compete in the M&A market for these early stage biotech companies, and that's that's true. But are they doing? That's effectively like saying they've outsourced their R&D. Is it really any? Is it really any different? And the one parallel I draw on is, perhaps interestingly, is from the film industry. From the old Hollywood film industry.
Right.
And the parallel, I think, is more than superficial, because fundamentally, the pharma industry is a content industry, right? The content is knowledge about chemistry, knowledge about biology, it's intellectual property. And Hollywood is pretty much the same, right? And there was a time when Hollywood was fully vertically integrated, just like a big pharma was fully integrated. Hollywood underwent a major shift where it had to separate out the value chain for antitrust reasons. Couldn't own the means of distribution as well as the means of production. They used to hold all the artists and develop and invest in them, which is kind of a good thing, but it restricted their ability to work across studios as well, for example. Going, even more recently, you've now seen the Hollywood studios become essentially large marketing organizations. It's individual, more dynamic, producers that are coming up with the ideas and the content effectively, and the studios are playing their role as packaging together the different elements, being that big center of gravity that can attract the financing and sign the big distribution deals. And I've got to say, even in fairness to Hollywood, even though 20 years ago with the emergence of streaming services and things like that, they were accused of being slow to respond, and arguably they still are. I think we could all agree that actually, you look at Amazon Prime, you look at Netflix, you look at these other services, they've actually adapted to that, and they've actually competed with it quite well.
Sure.
And I look at the pharma industry and think, okay, without wanting to get too superficial, where's the Netflix of the pharma world?
Yeah.
Where's that sort of interface to the consumer that can take drugs from here, there, and everywhere and package it up in a way that makes it meaningful to manage someone's.
So have you not seen one? You've not seen one emerge?
I mean, you see sort of variations of it, but I mean, I've not seen one. I mean, maybe you have, right?
No, I think the same thing, and it's a parallel I've drawn before of exactly that shift in the Hollywood model. But actually, the interesting thing about the Hollywood model is that it, they launch a lot of movies because they know that they don't know what people will like. So there's the ones that are bankers, there's the ones that are, and then there's the ones that are definite left field, kind of unexpected hits when they're unexpected. The interesting thing is in our industry, in pharma, last year there were 59 approvals at the FDA. 39 of those came from small to mid-sized biotech. Over half of the top 30 didn't have an approval at all in 2018. So you think, well, because they're only trying to launch the blockbusters, the Titanics, they're losing sight of maybe sometimes the successes come from some of those other places. So I think that it is an interesting time for the industry in how it's lost control of its R&D and whether its marketing group, its commercial side, hasn't caught up with that yet. So maybe the innovation that's needed is what the studios have done, which is to commercially innovate and look at some adapting to streaming and a bunch of other solutions.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think you're spot on. The other thing, I guess, with the Hollywood analogy is that even before the advent of the streaming services, for example, I mean, the independent producers started to hold a little bit more, power. There was kind of star power. I mean, the content started to, to rule, a little bit more. But what the studios were always adept at is finding out. They wouldn't always claim to make money with their films, but they would try to find the right audience for the right. Product. Is this an art house movie? Is this a blockbuster?
Yeah.
Are we going to launch this with a 50 million marketing blitz across 3,000 screens in the US? Are we going to do, sort of East Coast art house, launches and things like that, and let it grow by word of mouth. Yeah. And they have been, innovative. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that within Hollywood and pharma, the word blockbuster is used, and I don't think it's an accident at all. But what is that contrast of the fact that, since the advent of, I guess Jaws is commonly believed to be the first proper Hollywood blockbuster, since that movie was released in the mid-70s. Hollywood has changed its business model substantially in response to that.
Yes.
So on the one hand, yes, everybody's become obsessed about, franchising and repurposing, right? I mean, I don't know how many different relaunches of Spider-Man there have been, which I guess is the Hollywood equivalent of repurposing and finding a new use for the same, the same franchise. But equally, actually, if you care to look, whilst Hollywood has focused on that as in their production capacity, through their distribution capacity, they've actually supported a greater range of art house type movies as well. Yeah. And then coupled together with the emergence of streaming and their ability to really tailor content to their audience as well. You've seen tremendous innovation, I think.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. I think that dual use of the word blockbuster, I think is interesting, because I think that the industry is happy, the movie industry is happy to not have blockbusters, right? They're happy to launch, $20 million movies that make 50 million, because that makes sense for them, because of that segmentation model that you just described. Our industry still largely, at the large scale, has a view that a blockbuster is essential, and it has to hit $1 billion, has to hit $2 billion, and that tends to drive an attrition rate that lots of drugs just don't get there for commercial reasons, or will never make it through the pipeline. But some of those drugs, maybe by serendipity, might have hit the $1 billion if they've been allowed to launch, naturally and find their way to a customer.
Yeah, and I think this is where innovation and distribution becomes key, because I do have a little bit of sympathy, I guess, for a large pharma company. They've got, unlike movies, drugs are sold by people pounding the streets, fundamentally. Whereas
we'll come back to that.
Whereas a movie is consumed, kind of sat at home through, digital, technology, which means that you do get into that argument of, well, we've got this physical capacity that we need to give them something that, 10,000 salespeople can sell. And I kind of get that, but I think it's a bit of a poor excuse for not wanting to innovate on the distribution side and think, well, actually, is there a company that could be created there, a venture? Is there a business model out there that actually can provide the access to a number of different channels, a number of different pharma channels to the market as well, rather than just saying, well, we've got boots on the ground and therefore we need blockbusters,
right.
which is kind of how I interpret
more of the
that.
same old kind of model that they've always used, and keep rolling it out.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in terms of your investments and how you're looking, are you looking at the sort of discovery stage companies or companies that are playing in some of those different ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we start with our clients at a really, really early stage. When they're being spun out. So that's when they'll first come
universities
to us.
Or
of a university. Increasingly there are sort of biotech accelerators around the country. So from there as well. But fundamentally, a lot of the science has come from research labs, university labs, and so on. An idea is formed around it, and it attracts funding. So that's way too early for us to be funding it. Obviously, quite frankly, I mean these things are barely preclinical. They're doing sort of very, very early concept work. But then obviously the model is that some of those companies will do those one or two key experiments to determine kind of go, no go, and advance like that, even when they get their venture backing, their Series A, Series B, until that inflection point that signals, right, we're ready for sale, ready to be bought by a big pharma or a big biotech. And that usually is the exit route, right? I mean, even these companies that list, very few of them are going to be in a position to actually commercialize the one asset or two assets that they, that they have.
And is that the problem that you linked to before, and that in that distribution hasn't been rethought? So if those companies, I mean, let's say 39 of the 59 approvals last year were from small to mid-sized biotechs, who theoretically could go it alone, but probably won't. So they'll probably partner and get the kind of salesforce coming back through that. But if we kept the push going towards biotech away from large pharma, is there, you've seen this in other industries where the move's been away from salesforce towards, some of the channels, some of the way of communicating. And given that over half the approvals also were in rare diseases, that makes finding those the East Coast art house audiences a lot easier to imagine. Are you seeing any of that, or do you expect any of that to happen?
To be honest, I think the favoured route is still to sort of leap into the arms of a big acquirer with a nice chunky upfront and then successive milestone payments, which is, I mean, again, I understand the incentive from the the venture investor side. They certainly don't have the funds, and the sticking point often comes typically, as you well know, around phase 3. A venture fund, collection of venture funds can finance through phase 2 in a lot of indications, including oncology. But once you get into phase 3, it's like, who has the capital really to fund that? But again, this is my point. This is unimaginative, thinking. I mean, people much smarter than me have come up with ideas to say, well, actually, given that the NIH budget is like 67 billion or whatever it is, I mean, it dwarfs venture investment, it's a significant player. Why shouldn't, in some indications, for example, if you take a mission-oriented approach, shouldn't the government step in and say, you know what, not only will we fund that phase 3, but because we're funding it and effectively then becomes public knowledge, the distribution is less tied to getting a price that satisfies the return on capital for a big pharma company. Right? You create a different argument, not for every single drug, clearly, and this isn't about a wholesale nationalization of the drug industry either, but it's actually saying, in some things, we want this either to be, to take it, there's a different channel, to innovate around this. It's not that, well, if it doesn't fit into Big Pharma's box, then there's simply no route for it. I mean, that is totally unimaginative. And this happens in defense, right? When you look at the US defense industry, look at the innovation that's come out of US defense procurement. I mean, Silicon Valley itself, the place, and the first companies there were born out of US government defense procurement.
Okay.
Fairchild Semiconductor, all these companies won contracts for the government. The government basically specified a problem that it wanted to solve and paid checks to private companies to solve them. And that knowledge found its way into the wider world. most of the technology, a lot of technology in an iPhone
Mm.
came out of government funding.
Right.
And it's a great example of how you can use an imaginative public procurement strategy, to create knowledge that actually everybody can use, Samsung, Apple, to create products that attract private sector capital.
Yeah.
The US do this, I think, brilliantly. They don't particularly in defense, which has spawned a lot of innovation. But I think when it comes to health, you don't see as much of that mission-led approach to say, actually, pick AMR as a classic example where the private incentives are just poor for anyone to do anything. And there has been a little bit of noise around that in the UK about, there's a market failure, we need to come with a different approach. But that's often motivated by a market failure. What's interesting is that actually you don't have to rely on a market failure for another body to step in and say, we want that problem solved because we think it's important. And this is not about picking winners, even industries, let alone companies. It's actually saying we can at least agree that this is an important problem to solve.
Incentivize it, yeah.
Right.
So that's interesting. So, because one of the challenges you get with something like antibiotics is is actually a risk problem, right? Because you could develop an asset that might never see use, because the big problem that we're all expecting might never happen, but it might in a very big way. You look at the kind of Tamiflu type, success that it had because of one incident, which probably had that not happened, it wouldn't have enjoyed. That kind of mission and vision pull doesn't seem to exist on the in procurement of that stuff early, and we're trying to solve it at a very micro level rather than a macro level.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen in other industries.
It doesn't. No, I don't think it does. I mean, AMR is an example. I mean, I know BARDA in the US, is focused on, I guess, kind of threats to public health and funds programs. Stockpiles, obviously, medicines to deal with. Threats like that. So it probably happens in isolation, but does it happen as much as it should? Probably not. And is it seen as a pathway, for a legitimate pathway for innovation within our industry? I don't think it is, in the same regard. And I think that's to our detriment as future patients, and it's to the detriment of innovators as well, who actually do want to solve these problems. And at the moment, they're just restricted to, the same channel, doing things the same way, time and time again.
Is that a political problem? I mean, as in the timelines of, politics are too short to enable a 10, 20-year horizon for, solving some of those big problems? I mean,
you'd think not, because if there's one institution that's able to almost dismiss time, right, it's a government.
Right.
I mean, without getting into technicalities, the government can think of itself as an infinite agent, right? I mean, it's not like a VC fund that has to return capital in, in 10 years. Governments do fund large-scale investments. You got stuck on public transport because of all the work to do with, the new Crossrail thing, which is a huge decade-long, public investment. All these things. That's what they do. Again, defence is a classic example. It's a public investment with no real end date. It just goes on. We keep paying for future generations to have that benefit. So the model is there. I think it's a case of imaginative thinking. We sometimes draw these artificial distinctions between, government sector or public sector or the charitable sector, and the private sector, and never the twain shall meet. We don't really think of them as we should, which is actually interconnected as part of that wider ecosystem.
Sure. Yeah, and actually, even in the recent news, there's been a lot of drama around NIH-funded projects turning into pharmaceutical profits. But what you're suggesting is that part of the loop doesn't have to be there, right? That the benefit can accrue to the to the requester rather than to the individual company.
Yeah, it could do. I mean, I think, and I understand, the uproar that public funding develops these drugs and private companies benefit. I think it's a bit more complicated, than that, to be honest. For sure. I think there is a legitimate case to say, if something was developed out of the public purse, is it being used in the right way, or are public technologies like patent laws and courts, being used to expropriate, knowledge that should be more in the public dimension? We've seen that with the whole Shrekley story, for example, about things off patent effectively in the public domain being tied up. So it's not. I don't think it's not black and white, put it that way. But I think you can have more imaginative thinking as to how you fuse these elements, together. And I think actually the US does it a little bit better than we do perhaps here in the UK.
Yeah, for sure. I want to touch on the subject of knowing that you're getting innovation in an ecosystem. And obviously the subject of metrics and productivity is a sort of constant one. People measured annually on whether they're doing the right things or not. Mm-hmm. Do you see useful measures in the industry and or other measures in other industries that tell people that what they're doing is a good, that they're at least on track?
That's a really interesting question. Putting kind of an economist hat on, a proxy that's been used for decades to measure innovation is, the production of intellectual property, particularly patents. Patents aren't ideal, they have their flaws clearly, but they're a pretty stable measure of output. If you go back to that process I described of invention to knowledge creation, diffusion of those ideas, somewhere in there, public knowledge is combined with other public knowledge to create a private property which people will take steps to protect. So in that sense, patent output is a pretty good measure. And if you look actually at research across all industries, it does vary. Clearly in some areas, to do with IT and software, productions have been increasing, but again, this is where you get into the measurement problem that you get a lot of spurious patents in areas where it's easy to create them. Right. Patent thickets in software are a classic, example. A little bit harder to do in pharma when you're dealing with, the nuts and bolts of biology and chemistry to come up with, the equivalent of I've registered that .com, domain name, for example. But they're a useful, proxy. And what that tells you that in pharma specifically, productivity has been, declining massively. But actually, what's really interesting was a paper came out of MIT and Stanford by some economists there who looked at this. It was a paper basically asking, are ideas getting harder to find? And they looked at agriculture, they looked at software, they looked at hardware, they looked at pharma, and they found consistently, yes. Even the much taunted Moore's law, which is not a law of nature, obviously. It takes, compared to 30 years ago, 20 times the effort to deliver Moore's law today than it did, back then. Okay. Right. So
it remains true as a law, but actually
it remains true as a law, but from a productivity perspective, to deliver that, it's actually declining, which is kind of what you'd expect. But these guys actually managed to, to measure it, and even in areas like agriculture, which, again, you go back kind of post-war to today. Huge benefits in productivity, right? We've all seen those aerial pictures of those massive American, farms the size of an English county, for example.
Being managed by robots.
Exactly, but even in areas like that, productivity has actually been, declining. And what's interesting there is then to probe why is that, why is that happening? Is that sort of a secular shift? And that's when you get into, I think, some of the ideas you touched on earlier, which is how does innovation happen? If you accept that patents, productivity is a valuable metric, why are ideas getting harder to find? Why is productivity diminishing? And I think one of the insights is that the creation of knowledge, the amount of brains is but one factor, and the amount of brains who've been throwing at problem has been increasing. So why is productivity been going down? Well, it's because it's that diffusion part of the process. As knowledge becomes more specialized, it's harder for it to jump across silos. As people become more protective of their property, as Big Pharma arguably has, and other firms as well, it's much harder for them to, share that in a way that it can create new wealth and prosperity and lead to productivity as well. So I think, where we stand today, whether it's pharma, whether it's other industries, you need to look at the institutional changes that you need to make, rather than just focusing on one chain and saying, oh, well, there's enough capital, there's enough VC capital going into that, so that's good because it's at 5-year highs or 10-year highs, or, we've upped public funding. If you haven't solved for downstream institutional issues, the incentives there for people to grab onto property, Maybe property's created too early. Maybe there's not enough knowledge that's allowed to dissipate into the public realm for other people to use. And maybe people kind of sit on it too early. So some interesting thoughts, I think, coming out of it.
So that would be interesting. If part of your hypothesis then is that perhaps the silo-isation of pharma, the kind of, actually the kind of, inch wide and a mile deep problem exists at pharma, which is that they're this kind of jumping together of other technologies and innovations in digital or, the world of innovation outside of pharma doesn't diffuse in very easily at the moment. It might be incremental innovation on how to recruit slightly faster into a clinical study. It's business as usual, just slightly improved by the outside world. There aren't any Netflixes coming along to the pharma world, rethinking either the silos or that kind of or the potential of bringing in new ideas.
Yeah.
Do you see that as an active process in other industries? Are they actively looking for that, sort of breaking down those barriers to define innovation, or is this a?
So I think I can borrow from my own industry, banking, right? Like pharma, it's a heavily regulated industry. It can take considerable amounts of capital to become a bank. And arguably, if you look very high level, you would say, well, who were the big banks of 10 years ago, and they're still the big banks of today. But one tool that has been used to encourage innovation is, for example, regulation. Right now, on the one hand, regulation, it's always a double-edged sword. By imposing things like capital requirements, it can protect incumbents and make it harder. Right? Come out of the financial crisis, balance sheets weren't strong enough. Regulator says you need a stronger balance sheet. It's like, oh God, I was going to have my balance sheet here, but I've got to ask to have it here. I'm not going to be a bank anymore or start a bank. On the other hand, again, if you look at UK banking regulation, they've sort of mandated this, open architecture at the front end. These sort of APIs that anyone can almost develop, and we have to open up, our front end for somebody to use. So we are still the bank, but we almost become then, behind the scenes.
Right.
We become less and less involved in the direct customer relationship.
Okay.
You interact with the app on your phone, and that app is extensively plugged into our architecture.
Right.
And that's a way of helping, and people can add on facilities and functionality onto that front end, making them less reliant on us developing those ourselves, as well. Did we decide to do that independently? No. Would any bank have said, oh yeah, this is a great idea, let's throw ourselves open like this? But regulators, for better or worse, said actually, there isn't enough competition in financial services. The big four of today in the UK is still the big four from when I was growing up. And technology is changing every other industry. People want more choice. We should let financial education is still low. The banks aren't incentivized to provide it to retail consumers. How can we solve for some of this stuff? And this is one way of trying it. Now, that's not to say regulators are perfect and they will come up with the right thing every time. Of course they won't. But it's an example of one tool to change the innovation pathway.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So the parallel between, say, financial regulation, which is typically macro and government led, to something like look at the FDA, which actually has made things easier for pharma companies to at least bring pharma products forward, but isn't going to rule on the industry's behavior. It's going to rule on how easy or how hard it is to approve an individual drug. I don't see anything that's similar to the kind of financial regulations in our world. Did you?
No, I don't. And not to digress, but obviously in financial services and banking specifically, you have you have a systemic risk. All banks have relationships with other banks, and as we saw 10, 11 years ago, but we've seen actually many times through history, those shocks that could start off small can just be transmitted to the entire system. Pharma doesn't have that systemic risk. To all intents and purposes, each institution is largely independent. However, that's not to say there aren't other tools. So again, there's been a lot of talk, in at least in the economics Twitter, if you like. It's a pretty small part of Twitter, I have to admit, about using antitrust, both in software and actually in pharma as well. Now since the Microsoft case of the mid to late 90s, US antitrust especially has been pretty, toothless. But I think with the rise of the Facebooks and actually, and Google, people saying, actually, will there be a genuine rival to Google? And if not, is it a de facto monopoly? And if it is a real monopoly, A, does it have incentives to innovate? And B, is it always going to act in the way that we want it to act, because it doesn't have incentives? And you could make the same arguments in some elements of healthcare, particularly pharma, to say the industry might look very competitive. You've got lots and lots of big pharma companies. They compete in the M&A market, they compete for talent. That's all true. But it's also true by definition that when they get a drug, they have an absolute monopoly over that as well, which affects their pricing, their distribution, who to include, who to exclude, who to license it to in the developing world, for example. So, there is, I think, an emerging sense that actually in a range of industries, and not, pharma included, there are means like antitrust regulation that could be used. The other thing, of course, is just to sort of rip up the rule book and be quite radical and say, we arrived at this point because, 150 years ago, we didn't have big pharma, and it was very risky and very costly, and the vehicle wasn't there to attract the capital with the timescale to develop drugs. We now have that, right? Is that the right model for the next 150 years? Do we just create a different model? And lawmakers have the power to do that.
Something like Bell Labs in the 50s, 60s, when that was essentially broken up by fiat. And actually turned to a good thing for everyone. That they suddenly became more innovative as a result.
And that was clearly motivated by the fact that it became a monopoly supplier, and the regulator wouldn't have known what would have happened and how those businesses would have evolved. It solved a particular problem at the time. It's not exactly the same in pharma, as I said, because there is competition of the sorts until a certain point, but there are other means. As I say, you can create new organizational structures, you can create new incentives, you can create new laws, new legislation, you can create new pathways. I mean, this is a part of innovation that's actually overlooked. So we think about innovation in business and technology, and and even a boring business can be innovative, right? Finding a new way to run your shop. But then I think the bit of innovation that's often looked is, if you like, social or societal innovation, right? Just new beliefs, right, and new thoughts and how they get accepted, right? And new ways of thinking, of actually saying, what? Do we even need patents in the way that we used to? Or should we just have 10 years and that's it, no extension, no nothing, or should we have a different pathway? Should we not have patents?
Well, actually, then you get into something like Tesla and its view about what it owns and what it's prepared to make public, which is clearly been an interesting experiment for them, but it hasn't ruined their market capital, and their ability to bring new products to market. How they see themselves is pretty quite different than other car companies, though. Because they see themselves as makers of technology, whereas other car makers want to put things with four wheels out in the marketplace, like they always did, with a service kind of set up like they've always had, and
like they've always had. Exactly. I mean, it's instructive, I think, here to go back to, back to Hollywood when you think about what's in the public domain, what isn't. The most. I think I read somewhere that the character that's appeared most on screen is Sherlock Holmes, right? Like Sherlock Holmes is not in the private domain anymore. Anyone can make a Sherlock Holmes movie, and people still do, despite the fact that anyone else can still make a Sherlock Holmes movie. You mentioned the word, Titanic earlier, and actually that's even a better example. 20 odd years ago, two studios poured what was then a record amount of money into making a film about the story was in the public domain. Anybody at the same time could have said, I'm going to make a story about the Titanic. And as long as they didn't nip the whole dialogue and, find the lost footage in the back of the studio and bait their own version, they could have done. So, in some industries, the lack of being able to rely on a proprietary source of private information doesn't seem to alter the incentives to create new information. I mean, Shakespeare, it's all in the public realm, but people still make movies about Shakespeare plays.
Very true.
And so I don't understand why that can't work, or some variation of that can't work with our industry. It doesn't work under the current setup, and I think that's the blinkers that we all have, because we all try to think, well, how would that work? What would make GSK? It's that's where you're going wrong. You know, the entity to transmit that into the marketplace doesn't yet exist.
Right.
That's why you need to.
Yeah, I know. I think we're still largely set up to believe that you know, at some point in discovery, you're going to come up with something that no one else has, and that you're somehow going to be able to protect it to the point that you can, you know, see it through, and you'll gain competitive advantage from having done that. But you look at how many times that happens now, where someone has something that no one else has. It doesn't happen anymore. So actually, then it becomes about your ability to essentially take a common, you know, piece of content and do something unique with it. You know, have a better story or a better cinematographer or something that adds value that the other folks didn't do. And I think that's the bit that the industry keeps putting a lot of its energy into, coming up with something that no one else has, despite the fact that doesn't work anymore. Whereas what they could be getting better at is all of the other parts of the kind of the commercial innovation, the distribution innovation, you know, other technological advances that, you know, find it hard to make their way into our industry.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I completely agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. That's a good thing. In terms of the Europe problem, you know, not the Brexit one where I know we have different views, but the kind of European innovation question. Because I think there's no doubt that Europe has, you know, pulled away from America recently in terms of how innovative it is. Do you see that as a cluster problem, as in you need Oxfords and Cambridges to drive that, or is it a European issue, or is somehow that America, you know, taking its lead for a different reason entirely?
So my view is it goes back to this societal aspect, and I say that, I guess, because if you look at the history of the, you know, Industrial Revolution, and Europe was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, right? We can argue, I mean, UK was a driver, but it actually involved a lot of, you know, Europe in a fundamental way. You know, people think that England invented everything going in the Victorian age, but actually, if you get into the nub of a lot of the stories, a lot of the actual invention, the raw ideas, the technologies, were coming from France, were coming from Germany. It's just that you had this kind of, you know, near century of upheaval in Napoleonic Europe that meant that those ideas stopped, right? And we were fortunate to be living at that time, you know, where, I say the birth of the Enlightenment, where this concept of sharing knowledge, of being open and collaboration and learning, empiricism obviously took root, so a framework for actually evaluating knowledge and taking it forward, you know, sharing it and accepting that it might be wrong and there's a way to kind of get better. That was a kind of, the Enlightenment, if you like, was a social technology, a social innovation that took root at the same time. So the two very much worked in, you know, in tandem. You know, so you had these kind of stalled inventions in the mainland, if you like, but actually quite a conducive political economy in the UK and an overall European culture that allowed free transfer, relatively free transfer of people and ideas for the, you know, for the time. And that was a conduit through these ideas to channel and find their way into markets and to lead to improvements. So if I, you know, fast forward to kind of, you know, 200, nearly 300 years or so, you know, what's different? Well, we've still got the universities. Right. So I don't think it's about we need to concentrate everything in one place in one corner of southeast England. To me, it goes back to, you know, and it's not actually about the downstream problem of the capital necessarily either. Right. It's actually about all those ideas being, you know, diffused. Right. Francis Bacon, one of my heroes, you know, gave us a scientific paradigm in the 17th century. He basically said it comes down to, you know, the ideas, you know, finding a problem that those ideas can solve, and then diffusing the knowledge, to give many people as access. And I'm not, and capital will then flow right to those ideas. And there is a bit of a, if you build it, they will come type argument. So I think the silos have gone up, you know, a little bit. I think it's a little bit, despite the fact we've been in the EU for quite a while. In some respects, it's a little bit harder to generate that base knowledge. But I think there also is, I think, some parochialism at play here as well, you know, a little bit, as there always, you know, has been. I think, you know, and pharma's a great example where, we take our view. We've got to have our champions, and we've got to foster the ecosystem in a particular part of, England, and of course, the Netherlands thinks the same, and kind of the German thinks the same.
Yeah.
And competition is good.
Yeah.
We have got to have competition at the right level as well.
Yeah.
And particularly if your industry relies on early stage public ideas, you need to find ways to get those ideas into the hands of ordinary people as well.
Yeah.
That's the key thing. A lot of the innovators in the Industrial Revolution in England, they were ordinary people making use of ideas invented by geniuses of the time.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So that hypothesis would be, that the application sort of pulls ideas out of the ecosystem where they exist. It's almost, we describe this as sort of answers looking for questions, and better questions came along with, Manchester and other places that grew as a result of, in the Industrial Revolution had, a lot to apply there. They had capital, on tap from coal or whatever, but the application of the ideas pulled those out of the ecosystem. I guess the question, and then the parallel with that is you've got someone like Thomas Edison, who would often claim he'd built something when he hadn't, and then would backfill, if you like, into how to do this, or going back to someone like Pixar that would start a movie without knowing how they were going to do it. We don't see that kind of, wild-eyed imagination in pharma, or whether it's because of regulations or something else in the system. So no, I think that idea that maybe maybe Europe is taking a UK-centric view of things rather than a broader world view of things, and going forwards. Yeah,
and I think within pharma it's partly the industry as well. So going back to that earlier point, that we now have these firms and they have their culture. There's a culture of secrecy and kind of protection, wanting to preserve what they have. Sometimes yields more benefits, they think, than creating something new. And no one's going to disrupt themselves, right? I mean, that's the age-old thing. No one's going to, as I said, my example of open up their own piping to someone else.
Why do you think that is? Because if I draw the parallel with one of the previous idea colliders was with Joe Owens from Google X. And the idea is that Google is actively seeking to disrupt itself with the companies that it sets up internally. When you talk to pharma folk about that, they would actively hate that idea currently, and most of the people that I've spoken to. Is it a mindset thing? Is it what disruption needs to happen before a pharma company would set up 300 companies internally that are intended to disrupt the main business of the organization?
That's a really good point, isn't it? I think some of it is a cultural divide between different industries. Pharma, the timescales, there's always a sense of, we might get disrupted, but it won't happen, tomorrow. Whereas I think the very industry that Google is in, it might have an unassailable position, we think, but the industry that it's in, we know that there are technologies out there, industries where it doesn't completely dominate. It might dominate search and some aspects of data analytics, but there are other areas where it doesn't, where it has had to acquire, for example, to get a bit of a foothold, for example. So I think some of it comes from that culture of just you live in and work in an industry that moves very fast. You just got to be alert to threats. Again, to draw sort of rather haphazard sort of ecological analogy, it's whether it's the dinosaurs or the elephants or the giraffes, they're not going to be fearful of ticks and bites from mosquitoes and things like that, whereas some other emergent species, much smaller, that's more prone to those threats, is going to try and find a way to thrive and adapt and and be more open to evolving in some way.
Discussion. And we're at times running away with it, so I want to get onto some of the broader stuff about you actually, which is where do you go to read about the subject? Because one thing that I've always enjoyed about you is that ability to draw strands together from other avenues, so not just business books. For example, where do you go to think about and learn about innovation?
Well, I do read a lot. Some of it is keeping my own ecosystem quite wide. I'm fortunate to have worked across a number of industries, but work with some incredibly bright people as well. And I think it's also just being open to ideas. I mean, I'm very, very conscious of the criticism I've leveled at pharma and other industries that become big and complacent. And I try, to make sure that I'm kind of receptive to change and innovation. And I'm surrounded by people that are there to challenge thinking rather than think, oh, he must be right because he's worked for so long. So that's a large part of it is the company that you keep. And then there is reading. I mean, I trained as an economist, and I still find that useful. It gives you a particular toolkit that stops you becoming complacent or protective about any particular industry.
Is that because economists aren't always right about things?
I mean, they're not. Certainly macro-economists, which my wife is. But I think when you get down to, some of the stuff that I like reading, productivity paper that I mentioned earlier, some of the stuff on antitrust and regulation, they would rarely say that they're right, but they bring a perspective that's a little bit cold and a little bit irrational. But what it is free from largely, if you read the right stuff at least, is free from a bias that says, right, okay, because it's been, there's never an undercurrent of, because it's been done this way, then it has to be done, that way. And I think the other thing is, I read a lot and not always technical stuff. One of the, I know that you'd asked about, books and things like that, where, that I would recommend to other people on the theme of innovation. One of the ones I'd pick out is actually a novel, The Grapes of Wrath by, John Steinbeck, which obviously written a long time ago in the aftermath of the Depression in the 30s. And at one level, it's about a family living through depression. Everybody focuses on the depression side of it, and depression as being the disruptor to this way of life and the tragedy that befalls this family. But people often forget that actually it's also a story about innovation that happened in farming technology at the time. Huge innovation at the time that caused this disruption. And to me, it's always a reminder that innovation we always think as a kind of good thing today. It's the good outweighs the bad. Yes, nuclear fusion, nuclear fission, they have the downsides, etc., etc. But overwhelmingly, we think it's good, and I think that's absolutely right. But in the process, there are people that will get left behind. There are people that will suffer. And I think if you bring it back to today, some of the problems we're seeing, politically, I think are because people have been, left behind from the innovation process. They haven't been, if you like, compensated for the necessary loss they've had to endure as a result of the benefits the rest of us have enjoyed. So that's, it's not a book about innovation per se, but it's something that serves as a useful reminder to think, if having a culture of innovation is fantastic, but change is unsettling, and there will be people that lose, and not everybody that loses will be able to keep up and retrain as a coder and become an entrepreneur.
No, it's an interesting parallel, especially if you begin to think about, that pursuit of ever more high-priced drugs in the US, where a lot of people are just unable to afford their medicines. You think, well, that tension, is felt these days. Social media has certainly enabled us to hear those voices a lot more than we used to. But if you drew that parallel between needing to, think very differently about how you live and the consequences of what we call innovation at the moment, which is launching lots of high-priced medicines. Whether we're going to have a call for innovation that isn't just about launching more rare disease, $100,000 rare medicines.
No, absolutely.
In the space. Interesting. The other bit that I think is interesting is about the way that deliberative decisions get made. And I think that you look at books like Philip Tetlock's Super Forecasting or Stephen Johnson's Far Sighted about those kind of deliberative, as you say, kind of removing your confirmation bias and starting to look at how other things happen. It's interesting how many useful texts there are that are not about healthcare, but that are absolutely about healthcare the way that we've made it at the moment.
I think, and in the same vein, I'd put, there's been, to me it's a resurgence, but to a lot of people I guess it's, it's quite new. Some of the, literature, populist books as well now around, how we make decisions and how we frame decisions, to help people make, choices. A lot of the sort of so-called nudge work, that came out of Richard Thaler's work, and his associates as well, which I think is hugely informative across a range of, industries as well. I mean, just the very act of framing the same thing differently can have wildly different, effects. I think, again, it's a kind of social innovation to, to think like that as well.
Oh, for sure. Well, Mened's interview, you talked about that focus on, the way that things get framed. So it's not just about the number of candidates that come through, but whether these are the right candidates. You go, well, those incentives, we already know make a difference in our industry as it stands today. So saying that you've got a candidate, if that candidate isn't going to go anywhere, it doesn't help anyone. But actually, even the way that's framed in the current decisions is changeable.
Yeah. I think the another source, I guess, for for me, it's actually quite two old books. So David Landis, who's not with us anymore, he was a economic historian at Harvard, I think. He wrote like one of the best books around the Industrial Revolution from an economic historian's perspective. So really getting into both the societal and the cultural, aspects as well. I mean, it's a long read, it's a hard read, but even though it was written, nearly 50 years ago, I think it's still hugely relevant to informing today's debate around, change, because he does, go into the detail about either particular technologies and how they evolve, and there were so many parallels. I mean, I hadn't appreciated, we all learned about the emergence of the steam engine, and it's always told and retold and just seems like, oh yeah, Boyle's law, steam engine, and there you go. But it was through that book that I learned actually that even back then, patent litigation held up the emergence of the steam engine for like nearly 2 decades.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Some of the issues that we see today within pharma again, about kind of hold-ups and patent hold-ups and things like that, have existed. And I think I always take the view that you can look out of your window and the view changes, particularly here in London, but some rules, and this is why again I find economics quite a useful tool. Economic rules don't change, right? Demand curve and supply curves always pretty much slope the same way and imply the same sort of incentives. So if you use that along with other things as your sort of toolkit, you can actually take stories that you may think have no relevance because they were so long ago, but actually they have enormous relevance. I mean, even in the software industry, issues around networks and positive externalities, we've faced that before. If you care to look, I'm not saying we have necessarily all the answers, but there's no need to revisit everything completely again. Yes, there are nuances that require new ways to think, but we have crossed some of these issues before.
And I think that bridges into that idea of invention versus innovation really well. Right? Look at the emergence of electric cars early back in time. Was it there were more taxis in London in 1895 that were electric than driven by any other fuel? To get all the way back to electric taxis back in London now. Sometimes it is about those external factors, not the product itself.
No, absolutely, and I think it's not just the product, but it's the pathway and all the adjacent technologies, social and physical technologies you need. I mean, I'd read, I can't remember which book it was in, but the first car phone, to my surprise, was actually pre-1960s. Right, now you needed a battery that fitted in the boot of an Oldsmobile, and obviously the mass technology made its range, pretty limited. But the real limitation was less about size. It was, and it was less about affordability. It was just that some of the underlying physics necessary to make, mobile, even within a car, feasible, hadn't been invented. And arguably, it probably wasn't until sort of, packet switching technology and, obviously the cellular technology that made it possible. So you can solve one part of the problem and go, oh, look, we can get a battery that you can drive around in, and you can have a physical telephone, and it might be expensive, but, actually it was all the adjacent technologies and the the problems on the adjacent technologies hadn't been solved to get an invention into the marketplace at that time.
And I think that, I've drawn that parallel before, because I think that one of the problems you have with pharma is that they would have launched that and told the world that was all they needed, for the next 10 years. And this will be fine, because they need to sort of continuously improve because of the way the patent and other sort of setup has been built. Means that incentive to go looking for adjacencies, go looking for other enabling technologies hasn't always driven the kind of the continuous development of pharmaceuticals. Yeah,
and I think actually within pharma, another relevant insight I think comes as again, he's another economist, I'm afraid, but Hernando de Soto, who specializes, I guess, in the broad field of information and how that's an essential component. And he's applied to things like financial crises, which he describes the last financial crisis as really a fundamental breakdown in information. And I think he's definitely onto something. And I guess the way to think about it in our industry is that you can have invention, you can have raw knowledge, you can have capital markets, you can have rules that allow sort of the creation of enterprises. But then there's a whole architecture from the rule of law to courts to a police force to enforce contracts, all of which amount to actually people believing and knowing that when they get an idea and they want to take it through, that there is an information chain that attaches them to the idea, so they can benefit from it monetarily, they can transfer it, it can be logged and so on and so forth. And he's done a lot of work actually looking at different countries, including countries where you actually have a strong base of technology and knowledge and lots of brains, and you have money, whether it comes from government or the private sector. But where you have this missing gap around information and rule of law, you don't get as much true innovation. True innovation in the sense of invention becoming ideas in the marketplace as well.
And do you think that's going to get solved in places like India and other parts of the world?
They seem to be on the right track. I think the challenge with some of those countries, I think within our world, is that sometimes their needs collide with our, and by our I mean kind of big pharma needs as well. For them it's about widening access, and for a monopoly it's fundamentally about restricting access. Right? I mean, of course they wouldn't put it that way, but again, that's the clarity that thinking like an economist gives you, is that jacking up the price is just another way of saying we're restricting the supply of this particular medicine. And in some areas, of course, that's just inimical to what those developing countries want to do. So they try and obviously fashion their laws and regulations, whether it's through compulsory licensing, for example, to say, well, if you want to sell it here, you've got to license it compulsory, you've got to sell it at this price, and we'll give you the market. But you know what, I'm going to let you come in on your terms. Now, I don't personally have a problem with that. India is doing what it thinks it should do for its population. It's an example of innovation in the regulatory sphere, if you like, that we talked about earlier. But of course, it doesn't work for the incumbents, and rules like the TRIPS rules that govern how intellectual property is used under the World Trade Organization are written largely by and for the incumbents. So and that's, I know, is a bone of contention. So as much as some of those countries would like to change the environment, they do come up against a block of incumbent countries as well as companies who are there to preserve the status quo, which is definition of not being innovative.
Yeah, sure. Excellent. Thank you so much. I mean, the last question is, 5-10 years time into the future, are you excited for, what you're seeing? Because you see a lot of very early stage kind of ideas coming through. In general, are you excited about the way this is going?
Yeah, I think, within healthcare, the field that we broadly call digital health, this intersection of, software and data and the traditional world of drugs, I think is hugely exciting. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not smart enough to know how it's going to work out, but it's one of those examples of emerging technology leading to lots and lots of ideas. My only worries is that some of these things get packaged and parceled kind of too early. You know, people want to almost create companies too early, but generally I think it's a hugely exciting time, you know, to be alive. But we do need those incumbents to be, you know, challenged a little bit more, I think.
Excellent. What a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Nooman.
No, thanks, Mike.
Thank
It's
you.
been great.
Thank you very much.